Good afternoon. We're glad to have you today. We're going to be talking about much media about nothing, with a question mark there, with all apologies to William Shakespeare, the law of unintended consequences, and for better or worse. And so a lot to think about on a variety of things. And this is our quarterly Crisis Coach Spotlight Session. I've invited Karen Masullo to join us today with some insights, and Bill Breaker, who's our VP of Operations, may jump in. Hey, you can't ever tell who would show up on a day like today as we talk about these topics, because there's certainly been a lot going on, and we need to focus on what is this about, what do we need to do, and how does it relate back to each of us in our individual meetings. As we focus on our webinar, we are active on social media. You can see us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul and on Facebook at Firestorm Solutions. There is a hashtag for this section, and it's hashtag Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and helps you and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Our expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. And so as we think about this and our role as a crisis coach and balancing the push and pull, the yin and yang between risk and crisis, and we do all of that through a predict, plan, perform methodology. So as we think about this today, our presentation wouldn't be complete without a disclaimer. Everybody has attorneys. We've currently got our shares of one, and they say that we need to tell you that you need to look at guidance from your local authorities and your company's or organization's personal counsel, and it shouldn't be considered as legal advice or legal opinion. So as you think about it, those are the contexts in which we're talking. I'm Jim Satterfield. I am the CEO and co-founder of Firestorm, and we're going to have a conversation today about some subjects that you've been watching on the media, and we certainly have. And we're starting to see those same patterns unfold, and I think there's some conclusions that would help us think about those things today as we focus. So, civil war or civil peace? I was in a conversation with Karen, who is our EVP and Chief Intelligence Officer, and we were talking on that theme about civil war or civil peace, and it seems that we don't speak with each other, we speak at each other, and particularly in a highly energized political environment that we're in, and we come into these areas. And so a couple of questions started to come to mind as we were focused on that. Why are we surprised? Why are we continually surprised by what's said and what's done, and the level of violence that we're seeing and turning those things into action, and the interface between actions and words that were being said? So I want to frame that background as we look at this topic and continue to go on. Also, are barriers being broken down? Is it easier for these words to become actions, for violence to occur? We certainly have seen a pattern through the years that once there's violence in a community, it was much easier for there to be follow-up in those particular areas. Barriers seem to be broken, whether it was the shootings in Colorado or the ones in Orlando or all the other elements that are starting to happen. Once those barriers are broken, is it then easier for those to happen? Now, when we think about all these things, we balance it with a good old insurance term, and I've labeled up here Insurance 101, frequency and severity. If you're an insurance carrier, you're worried about how often will these things happen, and how bad will they be? How severe will those in fact be? And so there's a balance between frequency and severity, and I would argue that all the things that we're observing today are a function of both of those words. We're seeing the same things repeated on a much more frequent basis, and we're seeing them to be of significantly greater concern. If we think about the terrorism events recently in London and how those seem to be happening on a much more frequent basis, and the escalation of the violence associated with it, and if we go back to our predict, plan, perform, what's the probability that we're going to be seeing those types of actions here in America, and how will that occur? Now, there's a quote that you've seen me say or use on a variety of times that's either an Irish blessing or an Irish curse. It depends on what your perspective is. May you live in interesting times. And I'm sure every generation has always felt that their times were more convoluted, more impactful, more decisive than any before them. But it seems that that continues on. Now, as we think in this whole area, what's in it for me, the WIFM concept that's been out there for a long time, is where all of these events have to be viewed through that personal filter. A personal filter for the individual, for the organization, for the political position, for the geographic location. All of those things will happen. So what's really changed? It seems now that we are in an environment where the concept of civility seems to be certainly taking a back seat, and it's in an environment that things will be said and done in a much more aggressive way than ever before. Now, what you say can be held against you. We certainly have heard of the rights that someone who's being arrested is given, and they're being advised that they need to be very careful. Whatever they say can and will be used against them in a court of law. But I would argue that that's the most ignored right in a crisis that we will ever find. And today we're going to be talking about that in a couple of different perspectives and helping look at how we rate this crisis from an index standpoint. How severe is it? What do we need to be thinking about, and where we were going? Now, Karen, we talked about all of these things. Is there anything around these questions or comments that we talked about that I didn't address, or that you want to clarify or provide your insight on?
No, I think you're right on track. Thanks.
Okay. All right, so the first thing I want to point out is a concept that we've talked about in earlier webinars, but I think this is right up at the front and puts it as a very intense area, and that's vulnerability. And there are two unique elements associated with this, and that's certainly an area that we really need to focus on in looking in this area. The visibility vulnerability first is that if you're in a crisis situation, if you are in that media spotlight, if you're being intensely looked at by your employees, your customers, your critical vendors, by your regulators, everything you see will be magnified in intensity and overthought and overanalyzed. Just the mere fact that you're in a crisis gives you a vulnerability because of this increased visibility. So that's the first area to keep in mind, and this will be useful to help point out that we need to be very careful what we say and do in those situations. So that bullseye over to the right on the screen is to talk about that. Now, the other aspect of visibility vulnerability is being able to understand what's going on around us. What is the enemy doing? If you were thinking about it from a military or a war environment, and you were on one side of the mountain and the enemy force was on the other, you want to know which direction are they moving, how large is the force, what kind of weapons do they have, what's going to be coming through. And so having visibility into that force would tell you a lot about what your strategies and options are. Similarly, as we think about that, we have that confusion of poor visibility in a crisis because communications lines are confused or there's compartmentalization. In a war environment, we talk about the fog of war, the fact that you can't quite make out what's going on and mistakes could be made and happen. The same thing happens in a crisis, is the ability to see through to the other side becomes very critical. And that's where you've heard us talk about open source intelligence. Getting the information about what's going on becomes so very critical. Now, one of the things that we have found is that if someone has ill intent, 80% of the time somebody else knows, and 67% of the time 2 or more people know. So this visibility vulnerability of not being able to see what's being said on social media, what that information is, will cause us not to make the decisions that we really need to make in each of these areas. So where do you start? That brings us back to this gentleman who looks fairly confused with a question mark over his head. and lots of different directional errors about where to go. And so the key element here is a crisis isn't business as usual. A crisis is business as unusual. Now, normally we're used to making business decisions upon facts and metrics and data and proper analysis. But here in a crisis, it becomes a completely different environment. To underscore that, you've heard us say many times that everything you learn in the first 24 hours is wrong. That means that you're making decisions based upon wrong or incomplete information, particularly in that first day. And that's why your communications become so very, very critical. And the examples we're going to give you in a few minutes will lead you, I think, to that conclusion again as we look at things that are happening immediately in the media and in the environment that we're in. Now, if this first 24 hours is really critical because everything you learn is wrong, then, well, what about the following years? And the shifting then is the consequences. The crisis itself could be very short, but we have to live with the consequences for that for months or years or maybe even changing the brand. We do many times talks about a variety of subjects, and one of the things that I've seen work effectively as we talk about it, you get a group together. In fact, we've got a bunch of people on the webinar today, and I'd like you to think about your state and the state you're in, and I would say, tell me what the state flower is in your state. And sometimes you know that, sometimes you don't know that, but you would start to figure those things out and you could share it. And then I could pick another state and say, you know, what's the state flower of South Carolina? Well, if you don't live in the state, you might not know. If I asked you what the state flower of Colorado would be, you would go, I don't know. By the way, I did that in a group the other day, and someone in the audience said, oh, marijuana, which I thought was an interesting description of the state flower of Colorado. But the correct answer for the state flower for Colorado is columbine. But when we hear the name columbine, we don't think about the state flower of Colorado. We think about the shooting events that occurred there. So when we talk about the consequences lasting for years and changing your brand and your image, now you're starting to see the impact of crisis. Historically, we have seen crisis viewed as strategic within organizations, where terms like business continuity are viewed as tactical. So that's the reason we're spending time today to think about media, much ado about nothing, or is there really something else associated with it? Now, when you think about this, 6 Michigan officials were criminally charged in the Flint water crisis. And we're going to talk about Flint a couple of times today as we go through the process. But what's the goal here? What are we looking for in these types of areas? I remember when this first emerged and it became aware that there was a problem with water in Flint, and it comes to all the questions that we see asked in every crisis. What did you know? When did you know it? What did you do? Why didn't you do this? Why did you do that? Those elements will come in. But when you look at the fact that there's criminal charges, if you're getting a set of bracelets that connect instead of just a nice new bracelet around your wrist, this is a significant difference. And we're going to measure this in a minute as we talk about what's the crisis index associated with it, which should help you look at this. But clearly, this is a significant crisis for those in that community. Now, we also saw just recently the shootings that occurred at the baseball practice, and you see the pictures here coming from that area and talking about it. And think about that crisis as it started to emerge and the comments that were being made. And we're going to go into that into significantly more detail today. But I want to go back a step and frame it in light of attributes of a crisis. In a crisis, if you find in your organization you're facing it, you've got the events are rapidly escalating. They're happening very quickly. You can't slow the world down, and we'll give you some tools that will help with that toward the end of our webinar today. You're going to have the insufficient and inaccurate information. You're going to be under intense scrutiny. That's the everything you know is wrong. That's the visibility, vulnerability. You're going to lose command and control. If you've had an incident where there's been a loss of life or injury, you no longer control your facility. It's being controlled by the first responders. And how you respond to this crisis will determine if, in fact, you have a second. Clearly, your brand and reputation will be under attack. And the fact that we lose sight of, in many, many cases, that every crisis is a human crisis. That certainly goes to crafting our messages and what we would say and how we would associate it with that. We also have to be concerned about silence is equal to guilt. And many times those comments are drawn, and we certainly can give you phrases so that you don't have to say no comment. But the last word on the page in bold says surprise. And I've shared with you in the past that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5, and it was my birthday. If you're at work and this crisis is coming to you as a surprise, which they all do, then it's certainly not going to be a positive event. It's going to be a negative. And so let's take a look at this a little bit more and focus on it. Now, going back to the blessing or curse about living in challenging times or exciting times, we now are challenged by communications. You'll look at some of the clips that are there and saying she added that the crude and disgusting things that she hears from the outside. His mother said he watches too much TV, was shot in the hip. It's karma. Literally bit him in the ass as if that had occurred. Is the universe making social justice statement? Republican politicians are being targeted now. Today's awful tragedy might have a silver lining. If you look at those types of communications, did they add value for the people who said them? And the answer is no. And in fact, it created a second area, and that comes back to our statement that can we predict your next crisis? And the answer is yes. It's how you respond to this. And I think as we continue to dig into this area, you're going to see how those things can continue to come up. Now you'll see here a quote from Bernie, related back to Bernie from last year in August. I want Bernie to win the White House. And Bernie Sanders join the Green Party, sign the petition. And then on the other side, you'll see the same gentleman as Trump is guilty and should go to prison for treason. These are strong words. These are words that start to polarize. This goes back to the concept that we were talking about. Civil peace, yes or no. And these types of comments are inflammatory and will cause that crisis to continue to escalate. Now, in Nebraska, there was a Democratic Party official, and you'll see Ms. Tipton here, and watching the congressman crying on live TV about the trauma they experienced. Why is this so funny? That's what a member of the Nebraska Democratic Executive Committee said, the head of the Black Caucus in that state. There was an immediate reaction from others. As you look at this, the entire chain of comments is unacceptable and lacks any level of compassion. The Nebraska Democratic Party officers have asked her to resign, and now you're seeing it's point and counterpoint. Let me give you another analogy that may help a little bit about why we hold back on communications. And we've said, since everything you learn in the first 24 hours is wrong, if you're communicating, if you're explaining, you're losing, all of those things are coming back. But I think most of us at one time or another have played ping pong. Maybe you are pretty good at it. I don't think that I'm necessarily a good ping pong player, but I can explain it very simply. You take the ball, you hit it over the net, the other person hits it back and forth, and you keep the game going as long as you can in that process. But if no one's hitting the ball back, you don't have to worry about what they'll do in the response. Are they going to slam it and it comes across very hard and very fast? Or is it they just going to barely tap it over the net where it drops to the other side? If you participate in this back and forth, this ping pong communications, now you're ratcheting the process up and there's an escalation. And the visibility vulnerability that we talked about comes into play, and now you're seeing the intensity here. Now, as a result of the comments that you're seeing, we now continue again. There's a need here to explain why I was doing this. I believe that my post was taken out of context. And if you have to explain all of this, you're losing it. And you know what? It's keeping the story on the front page. It's keeping it as a key element of who you are. Comment was not appropriate to begin with. The response back and then back and forth, and you're forcing everybody else to talk about this, and you become the target in that particular communications, and whatever the intent was, that's the case. Now, you've heard us many times to talk about the things that you must do in a crisis and the things that you must not do, but clearly there is never a time to use violence as a humor element in any way. And you've seen politicians and individuals draw comparisons back to polarizing individuals, Adolf Hitler, Genghis Khan, insert name here, insert name of an approach or an event that happened into those types of areas. But anyone who commits a violent act against someone else shouldn't be the base for our humor or our enjoyment. It's the may you live in interesting times. Is this a civil war or civil peace? Now, Caitlyn Jenner decided that she needed to jump on it and was attempting some humor. Liberals can't even shoot straight. And it's, again, making humor out of a particular situation for advantage and exposure, and it's certainly not going to give you the kind of an area that you're looking for, and it takes and makes the person the subject of the conversation instead of a commentator on that particular situation. Yeah. So whether it was Republican or Democrat, now you've seen both sides take that shouldn't be a point of conversation and making it one. Now, this is the gentleman here. Facebook yanks alleged social from Jane Hodkins' pages. And you remember the pages that I showed you earlier with his comments about what should happen to President Trump, what should happen to the President of our United States. And the reason to show you those and to bring it back here, I want to point out every time you hear us talk about workplace violence, and this is clearly an example of that, it shows that there are behaviors of concern. Remember the percentage that I said at the beginning of our webinar today? If someone has ill intent, 80% of the time someone knows, and 67% of the time 2 or more people know. This was a predictable pattern. If you knew and followed the analysis of this, he'd been living out of his car in the D.C. area. When he quit his job, he was out and focused in this area, and in a completely different set of behavior areas. This is an individual who was in trouble, who was focused on it and viewed himself as a part of the solution in analyzing these types of areas. So words matter. At the very first area, this is not what you would want to have happen and to focus on it. So as we think about those, I want you to think about visibility, vulnerability. We actually had visibility into this person, but it wasn't seen, it wasn't recognized, and in fact, it didn't occur. Now, there was a quote from Paul Ryan, and you could take this and hear this quote in a singular motion. It's like we here at Congress are united in our shock. We here in Congress are united in our anguish. An attack on one of us in Congress is an attack on all of us. But I don't know Paul Ryan personally, never met him. But I would tell you that if you look at the last sentence there and you read it in the broader context of an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us, I think that's a great sentiment for us to have here. And so when this crisis happens, it doesn't happen to just a person. It happens to all of us. These are the types of events because this is where the civil peace concept comes back in. And this is an area for us to think about in this crisis. But again, from an interpretation standpoint, how you respond to any crisis will be analyzed and interpreted by others, whether this was your intent from the comment or not. So if we think about it, it continued on the night of the game. Paul Ryan and Nancy Pelosi speak to CNN in a joint interview around it. They both got on LSU hats because that was the team where he was from Mr. Scalise, and looking at those particular areas. as we see it become an increasingly large national story. In thinking about communications, if you feel the need to talk, you want to identify the why of the communications. Why are you having this conversation? And other times you've seen us put up a slide that says, ask why 5 times. If you feel you must communicate, you need to understand why you are communicating. What do you hope to get out of this? What do you hope that this is going to mean? And that's going to drive you in those areas. Before you make your communications, stop and go through the Predict, Plan, Perform. Discuss what will happen next. If I send this message out, what is it that's going to happen next? Well, these people will comment because I said that, and now we're back into ping-pong communications. I said this, they said that, I respond, and it goes back and forth. You must plan then a high-level view of the process of what's going to occur, what are you going to come back and perform, identify what to do and to say. If we think about a crisis, the decisions that you make, the actions that you take, and the words that you say will determine whether this crisis will stabilize or escalate. And that's an area that we need to focus on. So if you find yourself in a crisis, take notes, write down the facts. That where did you receive it from? What time? Has it been verified? What are your action priorities? If you assign something to someone else, who did you assign it to? When are you following up? Have you confirmed that they've done it? What are the pending actions? And you want to stay focused on the facts. The dragnet picture there with Mr. Webb, as he noted when he interviewed witnesses to events, ma'am, just give me the facts, nothing but the facts. And again, that's the attitude of where we're focusing. So a quick decision process in a crisis is to focus on what is it that you know. Now, you'll notice that we didn't say, what do you think? It's what is it that you know? Are you concerned? If so, about what? What's your strategy and plan? What are you going to monitor? And the reason why that's there is we said at the very beginning, most of what you learn initially in those first 24 hours in a crisis is wrong. So you're making decisions on wrong information. You just don't know which part of that's wrong. So you have to monitor and continue to update it. And what are you going to communicate? To whom? How are you going to communicate it? And why are you talking? That theme continues to occur. And in fact, if you're explaining, you're losing. If you're trying to explain what you did or why this occurred, it will not bring you any value. So you want to immediately stop and ask why you're communicating. And again, our rule here is ask 5 times. If after those 5 times you think you ought to communicate, you certainly should. But those communications that we've given you so far lead you to say, why are these people talking about this at this time? What is it they hope to gain? Why is it they're looking to make those communications? Now, if we think about a crisis, and we're going to get into a crisis index, are all crises equal? And the answer is no. And the common element, the fact that every crisis is human, plays a real role here. But when we think about crisis, we look at metrics because we're focused on data-driven crisis management. As we think in these areas, we're not looking for people that have a good gut and they just have a good instinct and they can do this and do that. But we want to give them a systematic way to review and to think about each of these things. When we focus on a crisis, we look around this phrase off. What's off? And off stands for outrage, fault, and fear. Outrage is obviously some definitions: shocking, offensive, despicable, shameful, crazy, beyond belief, extreme. Outrage. Is there outrage around this crisis? Is there fault? Is there somebody that did something wrong? Is there accountability? Is there liability? And is there fear? Is that something else could happen next, and a concern associated with it? Measuring the level of outrage, fault, and fear will help you to determine, is this a crisis that we need to be talking about or not, or how can we look at the impact? So when we do this, we look at these 3 dimensions, outrage, fault, and fear, and measure them across a scale, a Likert scale, from none, guarded, elevated, imminent, and severe, to determine the criticality. Now, if you look at it, looking at the contents, the significance, the magnitude, the extent, acceleration is just getting worse, the change in volume. We regularly in a crisis, we'll set up an open source intelligence. Karen and her team will be doing that, and you'll see the communication start to escalate. It'll start to peak. We'll do an intensity map to see what are the issues that they're concerned about, and then you'll see it start to decline. That it is unless there's been intervening communication from the people that are involved, causing it to continue to remain in the spotlight and continue to escalate. Let's look at the Flint water problem and see where we think it would lie from outrage, fault, and fear. Was there outrage about the Flint? Absolutely. That community was up in arms. It was an active contention during the elections campaigns of the last year. And certainly there was no one in the state and probably in the country that wasn't familiar with the Flint water problem. Was there fault? Clearly. You had elected officials, you had people in positions of responsibility who knew there was a problem and took no action, who certainly didn't warn and alert people. Clearly there's outrage, clearly there's fault, and we're all the way over to the right in the severe category. And last, fear. Was there fear in the Flint water? Well, yeah, this is going to create health problems. My children could develop cancer. They could develop health conditions that will be a significant problem associated with it. And so if you measure your crisis in these types of areas and use those standards, it would start to help you delineate. Now, the more of their elements that are there, so it's possible there could be outrage but no fault. It's possible there could be no fear in a particular area. So if you look at those three, come up with a numerical score, the higher the total, the greater the probability that this is going to be a material crisis and create a significant event for your organization. So this type of a crisis index helps you to better understand. Now, if we have to communicate, and words matter and make a difference, what kinds of communication should we be focused on in a crisis? Well, first, it's coordination. That's the one communication that you want to get that information out as quickly as you possibly can. It's the very first communication in any crisis, and we would associate that with emergency types of actions. Evacuate, shelter in place, lockdown, lockout. We're going to have a reunification plan. We're going to get all the kids over here and the parents can come and get them. What is it that you need to communicate around those areas, and think heavily about life, health, and safety issues in that coordination communications. Now, while those are initial and immediate, most every other communication occurs at a later time. The communications about the crisis itself is one that could occur later or never in many occasions. In many situations, we're limited of what we can say and cannot say. Their confidentiality matters. If you're in a school environment, you can't tell one parent about another parent's child in what you're doing in those directions. So these will generally come well after the first 24 hours of the event. You pretty much have a pass to wait out in those areas. And here's a hint. If there's been an event where there is a regulator involved, whether that's fire, police, or a regulator along any particular area, let them be the party that's talking about the problem and what occurred in their investigation. They're talking about the problem. When you talk, you will talk about the solution and the next steps. And I'll share some hints again around those types of communications. But again, time is your friend. You do not have to be the first to talk in those areas. And in fact, we would encourage you not to communicate there. The last type of communications in a crisis is that's of compliance. There's a notification requirement. Cyber breach would be a good example. If someone's identity was stolen, you're required to let them know and what remedies and actions that they could take associated with it. But again, this would happen at a later time. You'll find that the statutes, while they vary from state to state, are generally that you need to notify within a reasonable period of time, and that is obviously not an imminent one. So there are lots of different compliance types of communications that would occur. Now, here we've taken our Predict, Plan, Perform and tied together a crisis communications plan. If you find yourself in a need to communicate, the first would be, who is the audience? Who are you talking to? What are they concerned about? And while there's a theme around this crisis and you're talking about other things, who is it that you're trying to communicate with? Think about the shootings and the Nebraska official that was communicating up there from the Democratic Party. Who was her audience? What was that audience's concerns? So if she had stopped and looked at those, it might have guided her to make a different communication at that point in time. After you've identified who the audience is and are focused around their concerns, then your ability is to start to plan. You want to tailor your message, your messenger, and the media, and here you think the medium, to the stakeholder that you've identified. As you go through these types of things, we're going to have consistency across our messaging, but how we deliver that would be completely different associated with it. You remember the plane that crashed in Indonesia a number of years ago and was lost at sea, and the families were ultimately notified that their family members were being declared dead by Twitter. I don't think that's a medium that's appropriate to deliver that type of a message to anyone. And so what that message is, who is delivering it, and what those elements are becomes extremely critical. Now, Firestorm is built around a concept of three. It may not be intuitively obvious to you as you look at it, but most people can process three things and three key messages. If I came the 47 things that you need to know, you go, oh, I'm in overload, Jim, that's way too much for us to think about. So focus on your three key messages. You've heard us talk about home bases and message maps. Home bases are things that you would return to in a crisis to communicate. And the quick rule of thumb on those, and this may give you a framework if you find yourself in a crisis, is that it's not going to define your organization or school, that you'll not be defined by this event. Whatever bad thing it is, it's not who you are and what you're doing. The second message is that you're going to invent the future. What that relates to is what kind of things are you going to do to make sure that whatever this horrific thing is that's happened won't happen again, or you'll be associated with it. But the last message is that you want to embrace the families, that you want to reach out to those that were impacted and support it. Will not be defined by the event. Will invent the future. Will embrace the families. Sounds significantly better than no comment. And if you think about our politician in Nebraska, if you'd said, look, the events that happened in Washington, D.C., that's not who we are in the Democratic Party. We're not about those types of things. Number two, we're going to see that we lower the rhetoric so that we don't have people who feel like their only solution is to shoot or attack someone. But we don't want to talk about who we are and what we're doing and all of those things. Our thoughts today are only with those that were impacted and their family and loved ones. Think about the difference in the way that message would have been received. Keeping to those types of broader themes, and that's a centering. It's the way to make sure that you're aligned and are focused on what you should be talking about, not what you think is funny, not what you think is trying to prove some preconceived vision of where you are. Keeping that central focus, keeping that central message. Message maps carry that one level beyond. Here are the questions that we would be asked. Here's our first answer, our second, and our third associated with that. Think about in your organization, what are the bad things that could happen? What are the crises that you could have that would occur? And then as you think about those, start to plan those answers now, not waiting until those elements have started to occur. Okay, I get it, Jim. I can see that with hindsight, some of these things could have been better handled. So, but thinking about the first hour, when we think about stroke or heart attack, we think about immediate action. You've got to do something right now. It'll make a difference. If you're having a stroke, if you can be at the hospital within an hour, there's medications that they can give you that will lower the impact and speed the recovery and reduce the chances of a longer-term impact. A heart attack, we have defibrillators in most organizations now, and the goal is to be within 60 seconds of having that to be able to shock the heart back into beating and to carry those forward. So the difference in outcomes would come back. So what's done in these first minutes and hours and days will affect the financial, emotional, and reputational outcomes. I want you to associate crisis, just like you would with a stroke or a heart attack, that it's going to require immediate action. And that first action is in the first hour. Because as we think about that, the decisions that you make, the actions that you take, and the words that you say will determine, is this going to stabilize or is it going to escalate? So Firestorm has a program called Crisis Stop. You can sign your organization up to receive Crisis Stop. Crisis Stop is a program where we will get on the phone with you in that first hour of a crisis, and we follow those words, the word stop, into a series of actions. The S is stabilize the situation. What's occurred? Help you look at that event just to slow it down and look and focus on those facts. The second thing that we would do is to focus on triggering the appropriate resources. Have you notified your insurance company? Do you have legal counsel involved? Do you have security coming on? Do you have counselors for your people? What resources do you really need to have? The third is to opine on the exposures. What's going to happen next? What's going to happen in the short term, the midterm, and the long term? Where do we need to put our focus associated with it in each of these areas? Now, the last one is preventing the common mistakes. We see these repeated over and over in a crisis. People coming up to someone and saying, well, I know how you feel. And the reaction from the person that's gone through the crisis is, no, you don't. You don't know how I feel. It didn't happen to you. It didn't happen to your family member. And that type of a thing will make this crisis worse and a significant difference. We've looked at differences of outcomes, and you look at the financial liability or the emotional liability or the liability across any particular area. Those things make a difference in terms of what you need to do. Slowing that crisis down, giving you that hour to have a pragmatic answer, some of the quotes that we've already shared with you would have never occurred. They wouldn't have been seen. It's that spur of the moment, that off-the-cuff comment, that I'm trying to be funny or I'm trying to support my previously established position, is going to make the outcome turn back and become your next crisis. So Firestorm is available. Firestorm is prepared to help you and your organization, as we do with hundreds of thousands of others. We're working with insurance carriers where we're written into the insurance policy about providing this type of service directly. So what's next? We always talk about predict, plan, perform. You need to identify what could happen within your organization. Now, historically, from a business continuity program perspective, you hear the discussions about an all hazards approach. You know, what are all the hazards and vulnerabilities that we need to be thinking about? But it needs to move beyond that, moving into more strategic rates, the rate of change. How does artificial intelligence impact us, the autonomous vehicle, the new roles that are happening to us in a variety of areas. Establish a monitoring plan so you can see if the things that you have thought about, are they starting to occur? Are they coming into play associated with that? And then finally, to plan, to develop the message maps for each threat, risk, or vulnerability that you identified up above. Go ahead and lay those out. There are 5 common failures in every disaster or crisis. The first is supply chain failure. We all are 85 to 90% dependent on others. Who are your critical suppliers? If they fail, what would that come in? The second failure is the failure to train your employees for working at home. The third failure, where this is sitting right in the center of the eyes, is the failure to identify and monitor all the threats and risks that you have. And the fourth is the failure to test and update your plans, and the last is failure to have a crisis communications plan. Again, right in this individual area. An event activation matrix takes those risks that you identified in Predict and lists them in identified triggers so you can understand, are we at a guarded level, an elevated, or severe to be able to respond. And then finally, underperform. Training your employees what to look for. How do they use that activation matrix? Who should they tell if those things will start to occur? Conduct a test exercise quarterly around your communications. We see many times tabletops focused on what's happening with our decisions, but not what's happening with our communications. If you have a concern or you're about to consider that there's a crisis, contact us directly at Firestorm and participate. We're going to be doing a crisis exercise in August, and here's a chance for you to experience those elements. So if you look at all of these things together, those give you good places to start. Additionally, there is a paper about a brief about today's session when we talk about much media about nothing. And you can go to the Firestorm website. It should be up in the next few days, and you can download that. And it'll give you some of the graphics that you've seen here today. It'll give you some perspective that you can share with others within your organization. When we think about these types of events in a crisis environment specifically, it's not business as usual, it's business as unusual. Those words that you say, those are going to change the perspective because it's giving media something to focus on and raising your hand and self-identifying. You should become that target in that particular event. Those words matter. They'll make a difference around associated with it. So as we think about it, if you have questions, you can go to firestorm.com and you'll have the opportunity to download the recording from this event and other webinars that were done. You can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can call us at 800-321-2219. The Irish blessing that we quoted early in this about may you live in interesting times, it seems that we have gotten to that point. What we can also see is that we're at a point where we don't want this to become a point of no return. If we continue to use words in the way that we are, if we continue to have those types of events, we may be moving away from a civil peace to a civil war. This is a time for us to think about that, what we're saying and what does it mean and where we need to go. So I would encourage you to think about each one of these things and to think about what they would mean in those directions. So Karen, you said a few words at the beginning that you were comfortable with where we are. We've talked about this intensely between us. Is there any other observation you want to share with our attendees today before we close our webinar?
Thank you, Jim. Very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but I know it's confusing to organizations because there is speech that is protected on the web, and I know we all get confused when we see really vitriolic speech coming out, no matter what side of the political fence someone is on. We also have to look for other signals of behaviors of concern, however. It's not just a post on Facebook, but there are other behaviors that we have to become aware of. And so integrate that into a full risk assessment of our organization and then fold into our programs, our business continuity programs, in the overall scheme of things, what we would do if, perchance, something were to occur and where we're vulnerable related to the activities of our employees, from the part-time person who just started last week to the CEO. And I saw there was quite a bit of activity related to the Scalise shooting, and I saw two prominent people, business people, who lost a significant amount of business on both sides of this issue because of their responses. There were boycotts against their companies because of the way they responded, and it wasn't their political point of view. It was their lack of human empathy. Every crisis is a human crisis.
Good points, Karen, and I think you're right on target. When we think about this, it's behaviors of concern. Today we were focused on words. That's certainly a behavior, but there could be other observations. And if it's around the concept of violence, OSHA has identified that as a hazard in the workplace. So in your all hazards approach, workplace violence is listed there. Going beyond that, they cite over 2 million episodes of workplace violence annually in the United States. There are warning signs and actions that you can take. If you don't have a program that helps you identify and manage behaviors of concern, you're going to see a real difference. What we're also starting to see around our country at this time is that the deaths from opiate drugs are exceeding the deaths from violence. We now, if you add those together, look at the total impact that you'd have within your community or your organization. Those types of programs will make a difference. If you don't have a program to deal with behaviors of concern, let us know. We can help you put that program together, and it'll make a true difference. Thanks, everyone, for your time today and coming to you. And I think that when we do these quarterly calls, they're a little different than our monthly ones. We're trying to focus what's going on around us so that we can all see the same thing through the same lens. Hopefully today has helped to share those thoughts with you. Again, there will be a brief in a few days. You'll have access to the recording. And I wish you a great summer, and everyone have a great deal of enjoyment. We'll see you in August when we do another virtual exercise with your crisis management team, and we'll include some special communications elements within that exercise. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Goodbye.